All right, so we'll say good morning. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking Baruch Hashem, all of our sponsors, to thank all of our Talmud Torah sponsors, Jerry and Abby Applebaum, for dedicating the shiurim in memory of Basia Bas Chaim and David Ben Avram. Doctors Paul and Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of Mordechai Yoshua, Ben Peretz, Moshe, Valea, Miriam, Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the shiurim and the schus of Refuah Shalema for Kathy's sister, Donna Baker Matson, Stephen Terizin for dedicating the shiurim this month in honor of their grandson, Bunim Tzvi Hirsch, Naftali Tilson for dedicating the shiurim with gratitude to his chaver, Benjamin Wall, and with wishes for a Chag Kosher v'Sameach to the entire Shir. Avram and Shandi Kelman for dedicating shiurim this month, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yehoshua Herschel. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Dr. Mark and Elsa Lustman, in observance of the 26th yahrzeit of Dr. Lustman's father, Jacob Lustman, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. And I will say with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. A lot to do, Baruch Hashem. So I will say today's daf is Lamed Beis 32. And we are picking up Emirat Hashem at Lamed Aleph, Amud Beis 31b at the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says as follows. Gimel Achin Nesun Gimel Nachrios. So bottom Mishnah 31b. 3 brothers marry 3 sisters. Now, again, this is a nice case. Why? No one's related. I mean, the brothers are related, but the wives, the women they marry, are not, right? 3 unrelated women. 3 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, marry 3 unrelated women. Umeis echad mehem, one of the brothers dies. Okay, so we'll say the truth is, what's the good news? I mean, not good news, but you understand. What's the good news, so to speak, from a Yibum perspective in this case? One brother dies, therefore what? Straightforward yibum, right? We've actually never had a case like this, right? Where again, there's no complication, there's no wrinkle, there's nothing. Just we'll call him Reuven dies. So again, the halacha is Shimon or Levi will go ahead and do yibum. Okay, well, of course we're going to make it complicated. Va'asaba hasheni ma'amar. So what happens? Shimon does ma'amar with Reuven's widow. So let's say again, we'll call it Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven's married to Rachel, Shimon's married to Leah, and Levi's married to Bilhah. Just keep it simple like that. Reuven dies. His widow Rachel now falls to Yibum. So what happens? So Shimon does ma'amar with Rachel. Okay? Umeis. Now here's what's interesting. Now Shimon dies. Shimon dies after ma'amar, but what? But before he has the ability to do Yibum. So I'll say at this point in time now, there are 2 women falling to Levi. There's Rachel, who was Reuven's widow, with whom Shimon did Ma'amar, and there's Leah, who's Shimon's wife. They're both falling to Levi. What's the halacha? Hare'elu choltzos v'lo misyavmos. Incredible. Mishnah says, Levi, you must do chalitza with both of them and no Yibum. What happened over here? Shene'emar umeis echad mehem Yevamos yavo aleha. Shabbos, because the pasuk says, and a brother will die, right? If a brother dies, meis echad, one brother dies, the yavam should do yibum. So listen to what the Gemara Mishnah darshans. She'aleha zekas yavam echad, v'lo she'aleha zekas beis yavmin. Now we'll say, what's the drasha? The only time yibum is permitted is ultimately, again, when there is one zika upon the woman, upon the widow. But if the widow has 2 zikos, because it's meis echad mehem, when there's one zika on a woman, that's when she could do yibum. But if there are 2 zikos, she can't do yibum. So I'll say, what does this mean in application to this case? Who we focused on over here? We focused on Rachel. Because on a certain perspective, Rachel almost has like a quasi-double Yibum obligation. Or I should say, not Yibum, is subject to Yibum twice. How so? Remember, Rachel's first Yibum obligation comes from where? From where? Reuven, her husband who passed away. But after Reuven passed away, Shimon did Ma'amar with her. Ma'amar, I will say, what does Ma'amar do? Right? Not much. But it binds them together in some way. Now, when Shimon dies, almost on a certain level, Rachel is viewed as how? As a widow of Shimon as well. which means Rachel now is in the Yibum pool with a double Zika. A Zika from her first husband, Ruvain, and a quasi-Zika from Shimon. We look at that as a double Zika. The Gemara Mishnah teaches us, if a woman has a double Zika, she's not allowed to do Yibum. Because the way that the Torah frames the Yibum obligation is Umeis Echad. Umeis Echad. If you have a single Zika, you could do Yibum. But if you have a double Zika, we don't have you do Yibum. Therefore, again, in this case, halacha l'maisa, both women. Now, why this impacts Leah, we'll have to see in the Mishnah. But both women, Levi will do chalitza with both women. Pretty incredible case. But let's say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Zeka shnei yavmin, the chozman shelo kinsa ze adayin zekas rishon aleha. Because remember, again, as long as Shimon did not do Yibum with Rachel, so there is still the Zika from Ruvain, from her first husband. Vinotosefes aleha zekas ma'amaro. And then ultimately she has additional Zika of the Ma'amar with Shimon. Hari kishemes ze nosralash zekas shnehem. Ultimately, again, what happens? So when Shimon dies, so Rachel has this double Zika upon her. Okay, fine. So let's go back to the Mishnah. Says the Gemara. Rabbi Shimon Omer miyabi le'ezer she'irtza v'choletz l'shniya. Rabbi Shimon says, not true. Halach l'maisa. He can go ahead and do Yibum with either one of them. But ultimately does chalitza with the other. So the Gemara says, so we'll see why, according to Rabbi Shimon, you just can't do Yibum with both. We'll discuss that. So let's analyze. Says the Gemara, V'i zikas beis yavmin da'araisa, chalitza nami lo tibai. So we'll say, what's going on over here, says the Gemara. Let's, leaving aside the position of Rabbi Shimon, let's focus on the first position in the Mishnah. Right, so now what are we saying? That when Shimon dies, and both of these women, now there are two women who fall before Levi. There's Shimon's widow, Leah, but then there's Rachel, right? Rachel is the widow of Ruvain. Shimon did Ma'amar with her. So now what the Mishnah says is that halacha l'maisa, Rachel has a double Zika, right? She has like two Yibum connections, one from her husband Ruvain, the second one from the Ma'amar of Shimon. And when you have a double Zika, you are precluded from doing Yibum. And therefore, again, I will say, what sounds like what's happening over, and somehow because she's precluded from doing Yibum, therefore what? Leah is as well. Says the Gemara, look, okay, I never heard this before, but Lamaisa, if this is true, and it's literally, again, a psul da'oraisa, you can't do Yibum da'oraisa if you have a double Zika, so then what? Why do you need Chalitza? In other words, if she's disqualified biblically from doing Yibum because of a double Zika, so then halacha lamaisa, she should also be exempt from chalitza. To which the Gemara says, Elamid Rabbanan. You're right. This Rabbi says not a din da'araisa. This is a din d'Rabbanan. And what's the concern? Ugzeira shema yomru beis Yevamos habaos mi bayis echad misyabmos. So Rabbi say, what's going on over here? Look at Rashi. Last Rashi on the daf. Elamid Rabbanan. Dimid da'araisa ma'amar lo kani v'havilu shtei Yevamos mi beis batim. Rabbi is saying, what is the din da'orais in this case? Right? Let's play this out. Right? Reuven passes away. His widow Rachel falls to Shimon. Right? Shimon does ma'amar with her, and before Shimon has the chance to do anything else, he dies. Two women fall now to Levi, Rachel and Leah. We'll say, what's that halacha? Din da'oraisa. He could do yibum with both of them. Right? It's two different women, two different brothers, two different marriages, totally permitted. Right? That is the din da'oraisa. The Rabbanan stepped in and said, no. What are we concerned about? We are concerned that halacha l'maisa, if we let you do yibum with these two women, you could confuse this with a case of one brother with two wives who passed away. Because they're both saying, it looks a little bit like that. Why does it look a little bit like that? Remember, they're going to both say, what's the wrinkle in this case? What's the wrinkle? It's the ma'amar. That's the wrinkle. Had Shimon not done ma'amar, right? Had Reuven died, and before any of the brothers did anything, Shimon died, and now Rachel and Leah both fall to Levi. That's easy. Levi could do yibum with both of them. Levi could do chalitza. He could do whatever he wants. The wrinkle in this case, why? Because they're two women from two different brothers. The wrinkle in this case is that Shimon did ma'amar. And again, as we've established, that creates a quasi-marital bond to Shimon. The concern now is when Shimon dies, it has the appearance that Rachel and Leah are both his wives. So if we let Levi do Yibum, people are going to think that halacha l'maisa, you could do Yibum with two widows from the same brother. And of course, that's asar. So in order to avoid that, essentially Chazal mandated chalitza in this case. It says the Gemara, v'niyabim lechada, v'nechlas lechada. Okay, so why don't we let him do Yibum with one and chalitza with the other? Gezerah shemayomru, bayis echad miktsasa banoi, top of lamed beis, umiktsasa chalutz. Because we're concerned, once again, what does it look like? What does it look like? It looks like two wives coming from the same brother, and you're doing Yibum with one and Chalitza with the other. And Rabbi said, that's not the way it works. When Yibum happens, right, and let's say a brother dies and leaves behind two wives, the halacha is all you do is what? One thing with one wife, and that takes you. So I'll say, so we're concerned over here that if you do Yibum with one and Chalitza with another, then it looks like you're doing two things with two wives. To which the Gemara said, Yomru. Who cares? I don't understand. We'll say, let him do that. In other words, let him do Yibum with one and Chalitza with the other. What's the worst case scenario? That somebody in a future case is going to come along and let's say a brother dies, leaves behind two wives, so that the surviving brother is going to do Yibum with one and Chalitza with the other. Who cares? You can do Chalitza all day long, right? It doesn't make a difference, right? So if that's the concern, let it be. To which the Gemara says, well, 1 second. If the brother, in other words, if it would be a case where halacha l'maisa, the brother, if it would be a case where ultimately, again, the Yibum would happen first and the Chalitza would happen second, then einachinami, that would be fine. What are we concerned about? El gzeira dilma chalitz bereisha v'hadir miyabim. Rabbi said the concern would be more in a case where a man would first do Chalitza with one of the wives and then do Yibum. That's problematic. Why? The Gemara says, V'kamle ba'asher lo yivna, v'rachmana amar kevan shelo bana shuv lo yivna. The Gemara says, Einachinami, in a case where, let's say, simple case, Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven dies and leaves behind two wives, Rachel and Leah. And now let's say, say, Shimon were to do Yibum with Rachel and Chalitza with Leah. Any problem here? Any problem? No. Again, it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary because once you do Yibum with Rachel, that's it, we're done. But an extra Chalitza doesn't move the needle. Where would there be a concern? If Reuven were to do Chalitza with Rachel and Yibum with Leah. That's asr. Why? Because once Reuven does Chalitza, his relationship with his brother's widows are severed. If he then goes ahead and does Yibum, what he calls Yibum after that, that's actually Eishazach. Right? Or at least violation of a basic law. So I will say, so therefore again, the Gemara says over here, that's why in this case, where you have Shimon having done Ma'amar with Rachel, essentially what we just say is, okay, Chalitza all around. And what that just does is, it avoids confusion. Because we are just concerned that if halacha l'maisa, we let him do, technically, we're supposed to remember again, let's go through this. The din da'oraisa is after Shimon dies and both of these women fall to Levi. What's the din da'oraisa? He could do Yibum with both of them. The din da'Rabbanan says, no Yibum, only Chalitza, because we're concerned that this will get confused with a case of one brother who has two wives, and now we're concerned that the surviving brother may do Yibum with both, or even if he does Yibum and Chalitza, we're concerned that he'll do Chalitza and then Yibum. So therefore, in order to avoid any confusion, just do Chalitza across the board. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, what about this case? Nasan get lema amaro. Wow, listen to this. Another wrinkle in the wrinkle. Reuven dies. His widow Rachel falls to Shimon. Shimon does Ma'amar. Before Shimon, right? And then what happens? After the Ma'amar, he has Ma'amar remorse. It happens, right? Ma'amar remorse, what does he do? He gives her a get. Then what happens? Then Shimon dies. Now I will say both of these women fall to Levi in Yibum. What's the halacha over here? So it says the Gemara, Amarava, Nasan get Amaro, Huchrat Sarasa. Well, again, so Rava says, well, again, if Shimon gave a get, ultimately again to Rachel, then halacha l'maisa, when he dies, ultimately Leah is permitted in Yibum. Leah, his other wife, his co-wife, we call her the co-wife, she's not really a co-wife, but Leah, his wife, is permitted to Yibum. So the Gemara says, Aval hi asura demichlafa ba'alas get. But she Rachel is going to be asura to do Yibum. Why? Because we're concerned that ultimately, again, you may confuse her with a woman who received the get. So others say Amarava, Nasan get lama amaro. Other both say also in a version is that no, if Shimon gave Rachel a get, then what? Hutra afiluhi, and then he dies. Both women are mutaros in Yibum. Why? My taima ma da'avid ba shakle. That which he did, he took back. In other words, I will say. So the second version says if Shimon gave a get to Rachel after he did a ma'amar with her, essentially, what does the get do? It reverses the ma'amar process. If it reverses the ma'amar process, then what? There's still yesh zeka, but it takes away the marital bond. And therefore, when Shimon dies, Rachel is not really considered to be maritally connected to him, in which case, Levi's permitted to do Yibum with who? With who? Both women, Rachel and Leah. Rachel, Reuven's widow, and Leah, Shimon's widow. And Rabbi say, this is indeed how we pass in halacha l'maisa. We pass like the Rabbanon and like the Tzigidami. The Rambam says, number one, Rabbi say, in this case of Gimel Achin, so just frame the case again. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven dies, leave behind the widow Rachel. Shimon does ma'amar with Rachel. Then Shimon dies. Both of these women fall to Levi. The Rambam paskins, Levi must do chalitza with both of them, is not permitted to do yibum. This is a din dirabanan. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that if we let you do, Rabbi say again, the din da'araisa is Levi is permitted to do yibum with both of them. The din dirabanan is we're concerned if we let you do yibum with both of them, then what? People are going to confuse this with a case of a brother who has two wives and dies, and people will think that the surviving brother could do yibum with both. In order to avoid that confusion, we say to Levi, you have to do chalitza. However, if Shimon gave a get, he did ma'amar with Rachel, and then he gave Rachel a get, and then he dies, Levi is permitted to do yibum with both women. Why? Because the get effectively undoes the ma'amar, and we are returned back to the original state. I will say that is halacha l'maisa. Beautiful. Says the Mishnah, Shnei achin nesuin shtei achayos. Two brothers are married to two sisters. Two brothers married to two sisters. Okay, a lot to do here. Fine. Two brothers married to two sisters. So the Gemara says, Umeis echad mehem, and one of the brothers died. Right? Umeis echad mehen. V'yachakach meisa ishto shel sheni. I will say the truth is we've seen a lot of these Mishnahs quoted already. A very interesting case. Reuven and Shimon married to Rachel and Leah. This case, Rachel and Leah are sisters. So two brothers married to two sisters. One brother dies. So let's say Reuven dies. So I will say, straightforward case. What happens if Reuven dies? What could Shimon do? Right? Nothing. Right? Why? Achos ishto. Right? His sister's wife. So nothing doing. Right? Classic. We saw this already in the first Mishnah. Right? No, you can't do yibum. Says the Gemara now. We'll say, here's the wrinkle. V'achakach meise ishto shel sheni. They will say, now what happened over here? So here's the timeline. Reuven dies. And then before anything happened, Shimon's wife Leah died. So we'll say, so what does this mean now? So now Shimon is no longer married to Rachel's sister. What's the halacha? And I will say, before we go on, we know what's the halacha. Can't do yibum. Why? Good, because remember again, yibum status or yibum eligibility is determined at the moment of widowhood. So we'll say, here we go. So the Gemara says, Hare zu asura alav olamis, hoil v'nesra alav sha'achas. Straightforward halacha. So therefore, again, remember, even though at this point in time, Shimon is no longer married to Rachel's sister, he's no longer married to Leah, at the end of the day, since at the time of death, Shimon was precluded from doing yibum with Rachel, because again, Rachel was his wife's sister. Even though now, before anything happened, his status changed, status is locked in at the time of death. And therefore, ultimately, again, he remains precluded from doing yibum, even though his wife has passed away. Says the Gemara Pshita. Okay, we learned this already. Hashta uma hasam delo mitchaya mehai beis legamrei. So both say, this is actually even a more extreme case. We've actually had this case before. So let's say, when did we have this case before? We had it illustrated in the case of Shlosha Achin. Now, I will say, the case of three brothers, was even, remember again, it was 3 brothers, 2 of whom married to 2 sisters, and one of them married to a Nachris. So both say, but it was the same situation where halacha l'maisa, the brother who was married to the sister, right, can't do Yibum forever because Yibum eligibility is locked in at the time of death. So both say, that was even, this is even a more intense case. Why is this a more intense case? Because at least in the case of 3 brothers, there was what? A brother who was able to do Yibum. In this case, there's no brother to do Yibum. There's no brother to do Yibum. So the Gemara says, Hashta, in the previous case of 3 brothers, where the woman was not totally precluded from doing Yibum. In other words, there was a brother who could do Yibum to her because there was a brother who was not married to a sister, to which the Gemara says, Amrit lo, hacha de kamatche mehai beisa legamri lekol shekein. So both saying, if this halacha is true by the case of 3 brothers, then it's alachas kama v'kama true in what? Case of 2 brothers married to 2 sisters. Because I will say in this case, when Ruvain dies, there's no one to do Yibum. It's true, his wife, right, Shimon's wife dies later on, but Lamaisa, there's no one to do Yibum with. So it goes alachas kama v'kama. I will say, you hear the shaila? In other words, you've already told me this halacha in a case of 3 brothers, 2 of whom are married to sisters, 1 of whom is married to an unrelated woman. And in that case, Rabbosai, when Ruvain dies, there is someone to do Yibum with Rachel, but Shimon, who's married to Rachel's sister, can never do Yibum forever. So you've already established that. If that works in a case of 3 brothers where Yibum is possible, Alachas Kama V'Kama, all the more so, it works in this case where Halacha L'Maisa, Yibum is impossible. Impossible. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Tana, so the Gemara says, Tana, Hatana Beresha, V'hach Chazya Lehetera, V'sharia. Let's say originally the Tana quoted this other Mishnah in the beginning, and he actually thought it would be mutter in the previous case. V'hadr Chazya Le'isura, and then he changed his position ultimately again to reflect Isur. V'aydi Dechaviv Alei Akadma, and since ultimately again this ruling was more chaviv to him, was more dear to him, he put it first. U'Mishnah lo zazam imkom. However, the order of the Mishnah did not change at all. Okay, good. Tan Rabbanan. We'll say next case. We'll say now we're going to get into a very, very interesting sugya of Isser Mosif and Isser Kolel. Here we go. Actually, a really fascinating sugya. Tan Rabbanan. Ba'ala chayiv ala mishum eshezach. We'll say, okay, so now let's analyze this. What happens if halacha l'maisa, in this kind of case, Shimon has relations with Rachel? Okay, so now Reuven and Shimon, right? Reuven and Shimon, 2 brothers, married to 2 sisters. We've established straight out, right? Reuven passes away. Shimon is ineligible to do Yibum. And even if his wife dies, now both say, now remember again, what if his wife died before Reuven? What if Shimon's wife died before Reuven died? What would be the halacha? Right? Then he can't do Yibum. Why? Once again, everything is determined at the moment of widowhood, right? At the moment of death. And at the moment of Reuven's death, Shimon is no longer married to Rachel's sister, right? But again, in this case, halacha l'maisa, at the time of Reuven's death, Shimon is still married to Leah, Rachel's sister, and therefore Yibum becomes aser. And even if right after Reuven dies, Leah dies, Shimon still can't do anything. Okay, let's say Shimon has relations with Rachel. He does. So what's the halacha? Rabbi Yossi says there's double liability. One is because of brother's wife, because remember again, I will say, Eshes Ach, the brother of the sister of the wife of your brother is a biblical prohibition, is an erva that is only lifted when Yibum is permitted. But if Yibum is asar, there is still a prohibition of Eshes Ach, Umisham Achos Isha, and ultimately what? Because of wife's sister. Div Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say, by the way, just to understand, the only time that double liability like this makes a difference is if it's shogeg, right? Because we'll say in the case of shogeg, obviously you say, how do you have shogeg? Again, Shimon didn't come to Daf Yomi, and if you don't come to Daf Yomi, you don't know the halachas. He thought Yibum was permitted in this situation, so he has relations with Rachel. So we'll say, that's shogeg. He thought the halacha was at its mutter. So again, that would mean double liability, would mean double chatos. Two chatos offerings is what you'd have to bring. Okay? Rabbi Shimon says, no, Eino chayiv ela achos, Eino chayiv ela mishum eshes ach bilbad. Rabbi Shimon says, he's only chayiv because of brother's wife. Only one liability. Only chayiv because of brother's wife. Rashi says, Ba'ala, now I'll say, just to be clear, obviously the case we're talking about over here is where Shimon had relations with Rachel and his wife Leah was still alive. Because also remember again, everyone agrees, if halacha l'maisa, right, in this case, let's say Reuven passes away, and then Leah passes away immediately. Yibum is Aser, but let's say now Shimon has relations with Rachel. Everyone will agree that the prohibition of achos ishto, wife, sister, no longer applies. Right? In that case, it would just be eshesach. In this case, so we were talking about Reuven passed away, Shimon is still happily married, or he was happily married, right? And then what happens? He has relations with Rachel. So now both say, now there's two issues over here. Rachel is his wife's sister, and quote unquote his brother's wife. So the first opinion, Rabbi Yossi says double liability. Rabbi Shimon says only one liability because of Eshesach. So let's analyze this. We have elsewhere. There, Shimon says he's only chayiv once because of his wife's sister. So which one is it? Is it achos isha or is it eshes ach? Lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Everything depends. What does it depend on? Listen to this. Kan shenasa chay ve'achar kach nosa meis. Kan shenasa meis ve'achar kach nosa chay. Sirabo says we're going to see what Reb Shimon essentially holds is ein iser chalal iser. Once there is a state of prohibition, another layer of prohibition cannot be superimposed on top of that one. So essentially, Reb Shimon holds this woman. Here's what's clear, right? Rachel is going to be usher. Rachel is going to be usher to Shimon, right? It's only a shayla of what? Of what? Which iser? How do you determine which iser? Which iser? Whichever one came first. In other words, Shabbos say, what does everything depend on? Who got married first, right? Listen to this. If Reuven married Rachel first, then what? Let's say before Shimon got married, then ultimately again, then Rachel will be usher to Shimon. How or why? Right? Eshesach, brother's wife, and that's the iser. However, let's say Shimon got married first. If Shimon got married first, then Rachel is usher as asuratim. Why? Achos ishto, wife's sister. So it's not a contradiction. So yes, sometimes Rabbi Shimon will say that the prohibition upon Shimon is brother's wife, and sometimes it'll be wife's sister, and everything just depends on who got married first. Rabbi Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, ultimately again, where Reuven, they're calling Reuven the mace, right? Reuven is the deceased brother. Where Reuven got married first, and then only afterwards, I remember they're marrying sisters, and then only afterwards Shimon got married. So we'll say, if that's the case, listen to this. If Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, ein isser chalal isser, that literally, again, one prohibition cannot go ahead and devolve upon another. In other words, once you have a prohibition, nothing else could devolve upon that, so have a great chap. I will say, ultimately, again, where Reuven got married first, and therefore Rachel was asura to Shimon ultimately as what? Eshes ach. That means that when Shimon subsequently marries Rachel's sister Leah, the prohibition of achos ishto shouldn't devolve upon him. If that's the case, then when Reuven dies, Yibum should be mutter. Because all there is in this relationship is the prohibition of eshes ach, brother's wife, and brother's wife is lifted or set aside to allow for Yibum. To which the Gemara says, Kevan da isra achos isha lochal tisyabim yabume. Amar Rashi, no. Isra achos isha misla tali vikoi. So I'll say, interestingly enough, when Rabbi Shimon holds that essentially ein isra chalal isra, that one prohibition cannot devolve upon another prohibition, ultimately what he's saying is like this. What happens to that second prohibition? It hovers. It's there, right? It's there. It's hovering. Why is it hovering? Because should for some reason the first prohibition go away, what happens? That second one sets in. So what the Gemara is essentially saying is, even Rabbi Shimon would agree, you can't, even if somehow you were to actively set aside the prohibition of eshes ach, the moment you set that aside, what comes in instead? The prohibition of achos isha. So the Gemara says, "V'ipaka isra eshes ach, asi isra achos isha, v'chayli hilchach lo paka." So we'll say, so essentially, For Yibum purposes, either way, he's not going to be able to do Yibum. Because even if somehow you manage to set aside the prohibition of Eshes Ach, the moment you do that, the prohibition of Achos Ishto will just immediately set in. To which the Gemara says, V'sav Rabbi Yossi, Iser Chalal Iser. So I'll say, now let's go back for just a second. So what this sounds like over here, and this is actually quite exciting, what this sounds like over here is that this is a fundamental, like Shas Machlokes, Iser Chal al Iser. I will say, when you have two prohibitions, ultimately, could one devolve upon another, right? Could one set in? If I say it's already prohibited, does another layer of prohibition superimpose itself on that? I will say, now again, remember, what is it now? What's the nafkamina? What's the practical difference? As I mentioned before, really it's a case of shogeg. That's really what it comes down to. In a case of shogeg, if you were to inadvertently violate this isser, would you be chayiv to one chatos or two chatos? That's really the nafkamina over here. So therefore, I will say we're assuming that Rabbi Yossi, who holds that if Shimon were to have relations with Rachel, that he would be chayiv twice, once for brother's wife and once for wife's sister, holds Isser Chalal Isser. To which the Gemara says, is that true? But Tanya, we learned, Avar Aveira, Avar Aver Sheish Bashtei Misos, Nidon Bechamura. We'll say if a person violates an Aveira, that has with it two different, a person violates an Aveira, Sheish Bashtei Misos, that for example has two death penalties associated with it. Rashi says, Shtei Misos, 5 lines after that in Rashi, Kigon Chamoso v'Eshes Ish. So we'll say, let's say for example, a man commits adultery with another man's wife, and this other man's wife also happens to be his mother-in-law. So for example, right? Yeah, there's no commentary necessary on that, by the way. I'll say, so again, Lemaisa, seriously, come on, people, right? So remember, so you have Reuven committing adultery with Shimon's wife, who's also Reuven's mother-in-law. Right? So which is fine. It's easy. You can have cases like that. So not like the adultery part, but like the married part. Right? So I'll say. So again, halacha l'maisa. Now Reuven has committed two averos, one of Eshes Ish and one of Chamosa, mother-in-law. So watch this. So what's the halacha? Nidon bechamura. So both say. So here's what's interesting. Eshes Ish and Chamosa, mother-in-law and married woman, carry with them two different death penalties. It's actually interesting. Rashi says over here that Chamoso is bisreifa, right? So relations with one's mother-in-law is sreifa, which is considered to be the most chomer form of death. And Eshes Ish, right, general adultery, is chenek, strangulation. So what happens if a man goes ahead and violates an aveira that comes with two death penalties? What's the halacha? Nidon bechamura. He gets the more chomer death penalty. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Nidon bezeka harishona haba alav. Rabbi Yossi says, no, he gets the death penalty associated with the prohibition that first devolved upon him. So in other words, Rabbi Yossi says, look at which Isser came first. Whichever Isser came first, that's the death penalty that he gets. So Rabbi Yossi says, so essentially what we look at is what? Did this woman become Reuven's mother-in-law first? Or was she a married woman first? In other words, which prohibition devolved upon her first? And whichever one devolved upon her first, that's the punishment that he gets. To which the Gemara says, V'tanya, Keitzad am Rabbi Yossi nido b'zeika rishona. What's the example of this? The Gemara says, Haba alav, chamosa v'nasis eshes ish. I will say, let's say a woman was Reuven's mother-in-law before she was a married woman. I will say, by the way, totally possible. How is that possible? That again, let's say at the time that Reuven married his wife, right, his mother-in-law was divorced. Mother-in-law was unmarried. So she became prohibited to him as a mother-in-law before she became prohibited to him as a married woman. And then what happens? So the Gemara says, Chamoso v'nasis eshes ish. Let's say again, she was first his mother-in-law, then she got married. Nidon bechamoso. So if he has relations with her, after she's married, he's ultimately judged based on having relations with his mother-in-law. Sreifa. Eshes ish v'naseh chamoso. However, again, I will say, let's say she was a married woman before she became Reuven's mother-in-law, then Allah chalamaysa nidon be'eshes ish. Ultimately, again, she is nidon, she is, right, when he has relations with her, ultimately, again, he is judged as having had adultery with an Eshes Ish, a married woman, and therefore, again, it's chenek. Then I both say, now ultimately, again, what do you see over here? It sounds like, according to Rabbi Yossi, he doesn't hold Isser Chalal Isser, right? To both say, remember again, We were saying before that according to Rabbi Yossi, one prohibition could devolve upon another. Here it sounds like what he's saying is ein iser chal al iser, because we ultimately punish you based on the first level of prohibition. Am Rabbi Avo, top of Lamed Beis, Lamed Beis, Mod Rabbi Yossi, be'isr mosif. Oh, we'll say, listen to this. So we're going to see now over here that there's two different types of isurim. There's something called an isr mosif and an isr kolal. Take a look at the top Rashi. Am Rabbi Avo, Mod Rabbi Yossi, be'isr mosif, shehuchal al isr, kegon isr eshes ach de mosifu. So we'll say, we're going to see like this. When does Rabbi Yossi hold that halacha l'maisa, one prohibition could go ahead and devolve upon another prohibition? When the secondary prohibition devolves upon more people. When the secondary prohibition devolves upon more people, it widens the net, then the second prohibition ultimately again could set in. What is, I'm giving an example. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Shuchal al iser, kigon. Here we go. Kigon ishes ach, demosifhu, shebetchila kishenasa as achosa v'zupnuya, ne'esra Allah mishum achos isha. Let's give you a simple example. Let's say Shimon gets married first, right? So Shimon marries Leah. So Rachel is prohibited to him, right? Why is Rachel prohibited to him? Why? She is his wife's sister, achos isha. Okay. Now what happens? Now as achos isha. So who is Rachel prohibited to? Who is she prohibited to? Shimon, right? But that's it. Only Shimon, right? Let's say it's Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Right? She's only prohibited to Shimon because Shimon is married to her sister. So watch this. Niseis le'echamehem. But once Reuven marries Rachel, someone say, now what happens? Suddenly, who is Rachel asura to? Who is she asura to? All of the brothers. Rabbi say, that is called an isser mosif. When a secondary isser makes her asura to more people, that's an isser mosif. So Rabbi say, what the Gemara is suggesting is as follows. Rabbi Yossi doesn't just hold like a blanket isser halal isser. In order for a secondary isser to devolve upon an already existing isser, the second isser essentially has to cast a wider net. That's the halacha. It has to cast a wider net. And if it casts a wider net, then it could devolve upon the first isser. But if the second isser does not cast a wider net, and wider net is defined by including more people, then halacha l'maisa it's not chal. To which the Gemara says, so we'll say this makes sense in a case where, like I just said, Shimon married his wife first, right? Shimon married Leah before Reuven married Rachel. Miga di tosif Israel gabe achim, because then when Reuven goes ahead and marries Leah, so that's an Isra Mosif. Why? Because now suddenly Rachel is Asura to more people, right? She's Asura to all of the brothers. So then that makes sense. Itosif Isra legabe didei. Then halacha l'maisa now, she's also going to be an additional layer of Isra to Shimon. Because just like again, there's a new Isra legabe all the other brothers, we could say Isra Mosif, Isra Chal al Isra, and she will be Asura to Shimon with an additional layer, right? Originally she's Asura to Shimon. How? Because of Achos Ishto, she is the sister of his wife. And now, halacha l'maisa, there will be, an additional layer of Isser, because now she's Asura to all the other brothers, as Eshes Ach. And if she's going to be Asura to the other brothers as Eshes Ach, she will be Asura to Shimon as Eshes Ach as well. That's what's called an Isser Mosif. However, Elehecha de Nasames, V'achakach Nasachai. But I will say, in the case, ultimately, where Reuven got married first, let's say Reuven married Rachel first. He married Rachel first, which means that what Rabbi will say, Shimon's first introduction to Rachel is as Eshesach, as brother's wife, V'achakach Nasachai, and then afterwards, halacha l'maisa, Shimon got married. My Isser Mosif Ika. Rabbi will say, there's no Isser Mosif. Because remember, the only additional Isra that comes about when Shimon gets married is what? Is Achos Ishto. But that's not an Isra Mosif, Rabbi say. See, Rabbi say, the other example is what's called an Isra Kolel. An Isra Kolel means there's a new Isra that makes more Isurim for the already existing pool, but does not go ahead and devolve upon anyone additional. What's the good example of that? The good example that Rabbi says, watch this. Reuven Reuven got married first, right? I'm sorry, Shimon got married first. Right? So we'll say, so what? No. Sorry. No, Reuven got married first. Okay, here we go. Reuven got married first. So we'll say when Reuven marries Rachel, so ultimately again, what's Shimon's relationship to Rachel? Eishes Ach, prohibited. Now Shimon gets married. He marries Rachel's sister Leah. So we'll say now there's what? An additional Isser. What's the additional Isser? Achos Ishto. Now we'll say, who does that additional Isser devolve upon? Only Shimon. That's called an Isser Kolel. Isser Kolel means there's more prohibitions upon the same number of people. See here, all that's happened when Shimon got married is Shimon himself now has an additional Isser. Are there any more people included in that Isser? No. So we'll say we're going to make a distinction between what's called an Isser Mosif. Isser Mosif means when a secondary lav includes more people, and an Isser Kolel, where a secondary lav doesn't include more people. It just puts more levels of prohibition on the same existing pool. To which the Gemara says, "V'chitema miga de Isser bekulu achvasa high Isser kolahu." Maybe you'll say now that since she is asura, all the other brothers, that's also called an Isser kolel. Ela amarava ma'ale ani alav kilu asa shtayim ve'eno chai vela achas. Ultimately, again, Rava says, I will count it as if he went ahead and committed 2 transgressions, but yet ultimately, again, we'll only hold him accountable for 1. V'chein ki yasser Rabbi Yochanan ma'ala ani alav kilu asa beis ve'eno chayiv ela achas. I will treat it ultimately again as if he committed 2 transgressions, and ultimately again is only going to be chayiv for 1. So we'll say, what does that mean? My nafkamina, the kavro bein rishaim gemurim. Rabbi said, listen to this. The nafkamina ultimately will be, where do we bury a person? Rabbi said, it's actually quite fascinating. Rashi points out over here, if you look at Rashi Ela Amarava very quickly, so the Gemara says as follows. Look at Rashi Ela Amarava. The Olam Leslie Rabbi Yossi Isser Chalal Isser. It could perhaps be that Rabbi Yossi does not hold of Isser Chalal Isser. So what's the nafkamina, Rabbi say? Rashi says over here, the nafkamina is, do we look at a person who transgresses 2 things as a Rasha Gomer? Now we'll say, what is it? What's the nafkamina about being a Rasha Gomer? Rashi says over here, there were 2 different burial places. Ultimately, again, there was a burial place for people who were executed by Beis Din, but yet they were executed, but they were buried in a particular spot. And then there's a different cemetery for people who are considered to be Rishayim Gemurim, complete Rishayim. Right? Now, both say those people were buried separately. So if you look at Rashi says over here, Ela b'mezid v'le asos Rasha Gamor l'kavro bein Rishayim. So we'll say ultimately it could very well be that when a person transgresses 2 things, maybe we hold ein Isser Chalal Isser. And if you hold ein Isser Chalal Isser, there's only going to be 1 chatos. So what's the ramification if a person has violated 2 things or 1 thing? Is a person considered to be a Rasha Gamor, or a person is considered to be a good person who has done some bad things? What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina ultimately is, where are you buried? There was a separate section in the cemetery for people who were Risha'im Gimurim, versus, again, people who were good people in general, but maybe did some pretty bad things. Even they did bad things that warranted a death sentence. So Rabbi say, listen to this. The Gemara now says, Ubeplukta. In reality, Rabbi say, this discussion, so Rabbi say, we have a lot going on over here. So remember again, now we are in the middle of the sugya of Isser Chal al Isser. Right? Does one prohibition devolve upon another prohibition? And now what we've established is halacha l'maisa. Perhaps that depends on the nature of the secondary prohibition. Is it what's called an Isser Mosif, where the secondary Isser includes more people, or an Isser Kolel, where the secondary prohibition doesn't include more people? Just what does it do? Piles on more levels of Isser on the same people. Both say, watch this. Ubeplukta. This is a machlokis. Here we go. Both say this is fascinating. The itmar zar sheshimesh b'Shabbos. Rabbi said, listen to this case. A non-Kohen who serves in the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos. Rabbi said, which essentially means what? He slaughtered karbanos on Shabbos. Right? Non-Kohen slaughtered karbanos on Shabbos. Rabbi Chia Omer chayiv shtayim. Rabbi Chia says you're chayiv twice. Chayiv twice. Rabbi says, what are you chayiv for? Number one, shchita. Number two, non-Kohen serving in the Beis Hamikdash. These are two prohibitions. Bar Kafra Omer Eno Chaliv Ela Achas. Bar Kafra says, no, you're only chayiv once. Kafatz Rabbi Chia v'nishba. Rabbi Chia jumped up from his seat and he swore, Ha'avoda, I swear by the Beis Hamikdash, Kach Shamati mi Rebbe. This is what I heard from Rebbe Shtayim, that you're chayiv twice. Kafatz Bar Kafra v'nishba. Bar Kafra jumped out of his seat and he swore, Ha'avoda, I swear, Kach Shamati mi Rebbe Achos. Rebbe said, you're only chayiv once. Wow. Hischil Rabbi Chia Ladun. So Rabbi Chia went ahead and started darshaning. What's the pshat? Here we go. Shabbos lakol ne'esra. Shabbos is usher to everyone. In other words, we'll say the Isra of Shabbos applies to everyone. Kisha hutra b'mikdash, etzel kohanim hutra. When shchita was permitted in the mikdash, we'll say, who was it permitted for? Kohanim, right? The kohanim which of a lo zarim. Yesh kam mishum zarus, yesh kam mishum Shabbos. Therefore, we'll say halacha l'maisa. When a non-Kohen does shchita in the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos, there's two prohibitions. Number one, you're a non-Kohen serving in the Beis Hamikdash. That's number one. Number two, you shechted on Shabbos. There's two prohibitions. His chil bar kafra ladin. Bar kafra jumps up. He begins the darshan. He says Shabbos l'kol ne'esra. I will say Shabbos ultimately is right. The prohibitions of Shabbos apply to everyone. However, kisha hutra b'mikdash hutra. Wow. I will say, Bar Kafra posits, there's no prohibition of shchita in the mikdash. It doesn't apply. In other words, it was categorically permitted in the mikdash, no matter who does it. Therefore, according to Bar Kafra, there is no problem of shchita on Shabbos. The only problem you have is what in the mikdash? The only problem you have is non-Kohen serving in the mikdash. Therefore, Bar Kafra says, you're only going to be chayiv once. Incredible. Next, also, we're going to go through all of these cases. Balmum, sheshimish betuma. Here's the next case. So let's say you have a Kohen who is blemished. He has a mum, and he's also tamei. And he did the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say two issues, a balmum and tamei. Rabbi Chia Omer chayiv shtein. Rabbi Chia says you chayiv twice. Bar Kafra Omer eino chayiv ela achas. Bar Kafra says you only chayiv once. Here we go. Very passionate discussion. Kafas Rabbi Chia v'nishba. Rabbi Chia jumped out of his seat and he said, Ha'avoda, kach shamati mi Rebbe shtayim. Rebbe said you chayiv twice. Kafas Bar Kafra v'nishba. Avoda, kach shamati mi Rebbe achas. Rebbe said you only chayiv once. His chil, Rabbi Chia ladun. So ultimately Rabbi Chia began to darshan tumah l'kol ne'esra. Kisha hutra b'mikdash, eitzel kohanim t'mimim hutra. The kohanim t'mimim hutra, v'lo le'bali mumim. We'll say, tumah is d'chuya b'tzibor, or hutra b'tzibor, right? When it comes to communal offerings, you could offer them even b'tumah. We'll say, who was that dispensation granted to? To kohanim. And to kohanim who are fit for service, not to bali mumim. Therefore, yesh kan bali mumim, yesh kan mishum tumah. Therefore, Yechiah says you chayiv twice. Once for Ba'ali Mumin, and ultimately once for Tumah. Hischil Bar Kafra, Lodun Bar Kafra says, no, Tumah lakol ne'esra, or Kisha hutra, but mikdash hutra. So also, you see this is the sheet of Bar Kafra. Bar Kafra is this dramatic idea, namely, that when something is permitted in the mikdash, it is categorically permitted. So when we say that you could do avoda in the mikdash, right? Avoda for the tzibur in the mikdash, but Tumah, that means there is no Tumah in the mikdash whenever it comes to communal offerings, no matter what, no matter who's offering that korban. So there's no problem of Tumah. In kan mishum balmum. We'll say the only thing that you have over here is what? Is balmum. We'll say very quickly one last case, then we'll stop. Zar sha'achala malika. We'll say, listen to this. We know the way that you slaughter bird offerings in the mikdash is how malika, right? Kohen grows out his thumbnail, essentially lops off the bird's head by piercing the back of the neck and lopping it off. I will say, only Kohanim are allowed to eat a bird like that. If you eat a bird, if you kill a bird like that, that's an avela. So Zar Sha'acha Malika, what happens if a non-Kohen eats a bird that was killed with Malika? Rabbi Chia Omer Chayiv Shtein. Rabbi Chia says you chayiv twice. Bar Kafra Omer Eino Chayiv Ela Achas. Bar Kafra says you only chayiv once. Kafas Rabbi Chia v'nishba. Again, a lot of jumping. Rabbi Chia jumped out of his seat and he said, Avoda, Kach Shamati mi Rebbe, Shtayim. Rebbe said you chayiv twice. Kafas Bar Kafra v'nishba. Avoda, Kach Shamati mi Rebbe, Achos. Rabbi said only chayiv once. His Rabbi Chia ladon. So Rabbi Chia said, Nevela kol ne'esra. Nevela is usher to everyone. Kishutra b'mikdash. It's kohanim mutra. The kohanim mutra v'lo l'zarim. The only people who have the right to eat the bird that is shechted like this are kohanim. But a non-kohen is not permitted. Therefore, Allah if a non-kohen eats it in the mikdash, he's chayiv twice. Once for doing the avodah, And ultimately, again, once because of Malika, Hischel Bar Kafra Ladun, Nevela Lakol Nasra, Kichurcha B'Mikdash Hutra, Ein Kan Ela Mishum Zars. Bar Kafra says, no, the Nevela of bird was categorically permitted in the Mikdash. And it's ultimately, again, permitted for everyone. Therefore, the only issue over here is Halacha L'Maisa non-Kohen doing Avodah. Rabosai, fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Chia and Bar Kafra we're going to see comes down to Isser Chal Al Isser. We'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach.